The rain didn't come slowly. It came all at once. The river burst its banks. Paths vanished. The ground turned to moving mud. Men ran, shouting over the storm, dragging what they could, food, tools, pieces of their shelters, anything that wasn't already floating away. One by one, the huts collapsed. Walls folded. Roofs gave in. And in the middle of the chaos, when everything else was sinking, one wooden shelter was still standing. Not because it was stronger, but because it had been built differently. This is what happened before the rain. They said the shelter wouldn't last a night. They said wood like that would rot, split, collapse. They said when the rains came, it would be the first thing to disappear. And as the jungle darkened that evening, and the clouds lowered themselves like a ceiling, it almost looked like they were right. Rain had already started falling in thin, patient sheets, soaking the leaves, darkening the soil, turning narrow paths into slick channels of mud. Somewhere deeper in the trees, thunder rolled, not sharp, not sudden, but slow and heavy, as if the sky itself was dragging something enormous across the forest. Down by the riverbank, the other shelters were already being reinforced. Roofs were being weighed down with stones. Walls were being packed with extra mud. Fires were being lifted off the ground, rushed, frantic, uncertain. And above them, slightly removed from the river's edge, stood his shelter. Wooden, raised, quiet, no mud walls, no stone base, no thick thatch roof like the others. Just wood, lashed together with care, angled deliberately, lifted above the ground as if it were trying to avoid something no one else was worried about yet. A few men stopped what they were doing to look at it again. Someone laughed. Another shook his head. One of them said, "When the rain hits, that thing's gone." No one argued, because in a place like this, jungle rain didn't test you gently. It erased mistakes completely. The man who built it didn't answer. He didn't look back. He didn't explain. He was inside, adjusting something small near the base of one of the posts, listening to the rain change its rhythm above him. He had heard the laughter before. He had heard the warnings. He had heard worse. And still, he had built it this way. The jungle had a sound before heavy rain. Not silence, never silence, but a tightening. Insects grew louder, then suddenly fewer. Birds shifted higher, then went still. Leaves stopped moving independently and began moving together, as if the forest were bracing itself. The rain thickened. It stopped falling and started pushing. Within minutes, the ground below the other shelters began to soften. Footprints filled with water. Trenches dug too shallow overflowed. Smoke from cooking fires dropped low and refused to rise. Someone shouted near the river. Another voice answered. Then another. The water was rising faster than expected. Not dramatically. Not yet. But enough to make people uneasy. The wooden shelter stayed quiet. Rain struck its roof and slid away. Not pooling, not soaking in. Thin streams were guided outward, away from the base, dripping harmlessly into the undergrowth. Inside, it was darker than outside. Not because light couldn't enter, but because it didn't need to. The walls weren't built to trap heat or block wind completely. They were built to breathe. The man sat still for a moment, listening. The sound inside was different. Muted. Layered. Rain above. Water below. Wind moving through leaves instead of against walls. He had built shelters before. Not here. Not exactly like this. But enough to know that surviving rain wasn't about resisting it. It was about giving it somewhere else to go. Outside, the river swelled. At first, it crept. Then it slid. Then it began to press. One of the mud shelters closest to the bank started to sag along one side, its base darkening unevenly. Someone noticed and ran to reinforce it, pressing more wet earth against already soaked walls. Another shelter's fire went out completely, hissed away by water seeping up from below. The rain didn't slow. It thickened further, becoming a continuous roar that flattened individual sounds into one overwhelming presence. That was when the laughter stopped. People moved faster now, voices sharper, movements less confident. The jungle floor had turned treacherous, sucking at feet, stealing balance. The wooden shelter still stood above it all. Water flowed underneath it, not around it. Small streams formed naturally. guided by the slope of the land and the open space beneath the floor. Nothing pushed against its walls, because nothing could reach them. Someone noticed. They didn't say anything yet. They just looked. The man remained inside, adjusting a woven panel near one side, lowering it slightly as the wind shifted direction. Rain tried to follow the wind inside, but the angle rejected it, breaking the flow before it could enter. He had placed the shelter where the ground dipped gently, not where it collected. He had lifted it because the jungle never flooded evenly. It chose its victims carefully. Another shout from the river, this one sharper. The water had reached the first row of shelters. Mud walls softened, then slumped. Wooden stakes driven directly into the ground began to loosen. Floors sank unevenly as the earth beneath them turned to slurry. One shelter leaned enough that its roof shifted. Someone scrambled out, just in time, as part of the wall collapsed inward. Rain erased footprints almost instantly. Paths disappeared. Everything that wasn't elevated became part of the same wet surface. And still, the wooden shelter remained untouched. From a distance, it looked almost fragile. Thin posts, simple joints, no visible mass to fight the storm. But that was the point. It wasn't fighting anything. Water rushed past beneath it, carrying leaves, branches, debris. The shelter didn't slow the flow, didn't give it resistance, didn't create pressure points. It let the jungle move the way the jungle wanted to move. A man from below climbed slightly higher ground and stared at it openly now. Rain streaked down his face. His own shelter behind him sagged, unrecognizable. How's that still standing? Someone shouted over the noise. No one answered. Thunder rolled again, closer this time, vibrating through the trees and into the ground. A crack followed, sharp and violent, and somewhere deeper in the forest, a tree finally gave up and fell. The rain intensified once more. Inside the wooden shelter, the man lay back briefly, resting his head against the wall. The floor beneath him was dry. Not warm, not yet, but dry, stable, unmoving. The sound of water passing underneath became louder, faster, but never threatening. He closed his eyes for a moment. This was the part people never prepared for. Not the rain, not the noise, but the patience. Jungle rain didn't end quickly. It tested you by lasting longer than your strength, longer than your confidence, longer than your assumptions. Outside, the river breached its sole boundary completely. Shelters that had stood for weeks shifted in minutes. Mud walls dissolved. Support beams slipped. Roofs sagged under the sudden weight of waterlogged materials. People ran where they could. Others froze, unsure where safety even was anymore. More eyes turned toward the raised wooden structure. It had stopped being a joke. It hadn't become impressive yet, just confusing. Why had he built it so light? Why had he lifted it so high? Why had he chosen wood where everyone else chose mud and stone? The answers weren't obvious. Not yet. The rain kept coming, and the jungle began to take everything that had been built without it in mind. By the time the rain showed no sign of easing, people stopped pretending it would. The jungle had fully committed to the storm. Water no longer fell in drops. It pressed downward in sheets so dense the distance between ground and sky felt compressed. Trees bent under the weight. Leaves flattened. The air itself seemed heavier, harder to move through, as if every breath had to be negotiated. The river was no longer a river. It had spread outward, swallowing its banks, erasing the narrow strip of safety everyone had trusted. What had once been familiar ground dissolved into a wide, moving surface of brown water, fast and indifferent. Shelters that stood too close were already lost. Not dramatically, not with explosions or crashes. They failed quietly, the way the jungle preferred. A post sinking an inch too far, a wall softening just enough to lean, a roof absorbing water until it was no longer a roof, just a heavy thing waiting to fall. Men dragged what they could to higher ground. Tools, bundles of dried food, a few blankets already soaked beyond saving. Fires were abandoned completely now. Smoke couldn't rise in the pressure-heavy air, and flame had no patience for this kind of rain. The wooden shelter above them remained unchanged. Rain slid off it the same way it had an hour earlier. The posts held. The joints didn't shift. The space beneath it filled and emptied repeatedly as water surged through, but the floor above never felt the force directly. Someone noticed that detail first. Not the dryness, not the height, the movement. Water wasn't piling against it. It wasn't pushing sideways. It was being allowed through. A man waded closer, boots sinking deep with every step, careful not to lose his balance. He stopped just short of the shelter's edge and stared upward, rain dripping from his brow, his mouth slightly open. "You built it wrong," he muttered aloud, more to himself than anyone else. But his tone had changed. Inside the shelter, the man shifted his weight and leaned toward one side, pressing his palm against the wall. The wood was cool, but not soaked. It gave slightly under pressure, then returned, elastic instead of brittle. He listened again. The sound had changed. Earlier, it had been water moving freely. Now it was water moving with urgency. The river had risen another level. Outside, someone slipped and fell hard into the mud. Another person helped him up, both of them coated instantly in brown sludge. The shelter behind them was no longer usable. One side had collapsed entirely. The roof slanted at a dangerous angle, water pouring straight through. They looked around, searching for something, anything, that still offered structure. Their eyes landed where everyone's eyes were landing now, the raised wooden shelter. A few moments passed before anyone spoke. Then someone asked, "Can it hold more than one?" The question wasn't loud. It wasn't confident. It was almost embarrassed. The man inside heard it anyway. He didn't answer immediately, not because he wanted to deny them, but because he needed to listen one more time, to the wind, to the water, to the shifting pressure in the air. The jungle never announced its next move. It hinted. Finally, he stood and moved toward the edge, crouching near the opening. "It can," he said. His voice didn't carry far. It didn't need to. Relief moved through the group like a current. One by one, people approached carefully, testing the stability beneath their feet. They climbed up, gripping the posts, pulling themselves onto the raised floor. Each time someone stepped onto it, they paused, waiting for movement, for creaking, for warning. None came. The shelter held. Rain continued to hammer the roof, but inside, the sound softened. The difference was immediate and unsettling. Outside, the storm was overwhelming. Inside, it became something you could exist alongside. No one spoke at first. They just listened. Someone finally laughed, not mockingly this time, but quietly in disbelief. "I thought it would split," he said. "I thought the joints would give." "They should have," another replied. "Would like this always does." The man who built it didn't respond. He was watching the water beneath him, the way it surged and retreated, the way debris passed through without catching. He had chosen the spot because the jungle liked it. That was the mistake most people made. They built where they wanted, not where the land already agreed. The rain intensified again, as if offended by the shelter's calm. Wind shifted sharply, driving water sideways. Leaves tore free and spun violently through the air. A tree farther downslope cracked loudly, then went silent as it fell out of sight. The shelter swayed slightly, just enough for everyone to feel it. Hands gripped the floor. Someone inhaled sharply. Then it stopped. The movement wasn't weakness. It was release. The structure absorbed the force, redirected it, allowed it to pass without transferring stress into a single breaking point. The joints flexed, then returned, exactly as intended. No one said anything, but the looks exchanged were different now. This wasn't luck. Hours passed. Rain did not relent. The river spread wider, then wider still, swallowing what little ground remained exposed. Shelters that had survived the first hours finally surrendered. One roof collapsed inward completely, the sound swallowed instantly by the storm. People who hadn't made it to higher ground in time waited desperately, dragging themselves toward trees, toward rocks, toward anything that wasn't moving beneath them. Those who had climbed into the wooden shelter stayed silent, watching the jungle erase everything they thought they understood about building. Inside, the air stayed breathable. Moist, yes. Everything in the jungle was moist, but not suffocating. The gaps between boards allowed pressure to equalize. Wind passed through instead of pushing against solid walls. Someone noticed their clothes drying slowly. Not quickly, not completely, but enough. That detail unsettled them more than the shelter's survival. "How is it not flooding?" someone whispered. The man finally spoke again. "Because it's not blocking the water," he said. "It's avoiding it." No one laughed this time. Thunder rolled again, closer than before, followed by a sharp crack that split the sky. Light flashed through the trees, momentarily turning the flooded ground into a chaotic mirror. Then darkness returned. Night had arrived fully now, earlier than usual, dragged in by the storm. Visibility dropped to almost nothing beyond a few body lengths. The jungle at night, during heavy rain, was not just dangerous. It was disorienting. Sounds came from everywhere. Distances lied. Directions twisted. Inside the shelter, the darkness felt contained. Someone struck a small flame, shielding it carefully. It caught, weak but persistent. The light revealed faces tight with exhaustion and disbelief. They looked at the man differently now. Not with admiration. Not yet. With curiosity edged by unease. Because if he had known this would happen, if he had built for this, then what else did he know that they didn't? Outside, the storm reached its peak. Rain fell so hard it flattened small plants entirely. Wind tore through the canopy in uneven bursts. Water rushed beneath the shelter in violent surges, carrying branches thick enough to have shattered walls if they had been allowed to strike them. The raised floor never felt the impact. Hours later, how many? No one could say. The rain finally began to change. It didn't stop, but it loosened. The pressure eased. The sound softened. Individual drops became distinguishable again, even if they still fell relentlessly. The river stopped rising. People dared to hope. Inside the shelter, exhaustion set in. Some leaned against the walls. Others sat with heads bowed, listening for any sign that this calm was false. The man stayed awake. He knew better than to trust the first quiet. The jungle liked to test you twice. When dawn finally came, it arrived reluctantly, filtered through thick cloud and dripping leaves. The world looked altered, not damaged, transformed. Where shelters had once stood, there were only impressions. Where paths had existed, there were channels of water. Where fires had burned, there was nothing. The raised wooden shelter stood exactly as it had before, dry underneath, intact above. People climbed down carefully, stepping into the mud with disbelief. They walked the perimeter, touched the posts, examined the joints closely. No cracks, no splits, no signs of stress beyond what was expected. Someone laughed again, louder this time, almost hysterical. "They said it was useless," he said, shaking his head. "They said it wouldn't last." The man who built it looked out over the flooded remains of everything else. He didn't smile, because he knew the rain wasn't done teaching its lesson yet, and the jungle still had one more test waiting. Morning did not bring relief. It brought realization. As the light strengthened, people could finally see the full shape of what the rain had done. The jungle hadn't merely flooded the settlement. It had rearranged it. Familiar landmarks were gone. Paths were erased. The ground itself looked unsettled, as if it no longer recognized where it was supposed to be solid. Men stood in silence, boots sunk deep, staring at the damage with hollow expressions. Some walked slowly from one ruined shelter to another, lifting collapsed beams, uncovering soaked bedding, counting what had been lost without speaking the numbers aloud. Everywhere they turned, there was evidence of confidence that had been misplaced. Except in one place. The wooden shelter remained above it all, unchanged in posture, unbothered by the chaos below. It looked almost offensive now, too calm, too deliberate, as if it had never doubted the outcome. Someone said it quietly, without accusation. He built for this. No one argued. The man stepped down from the shelter and walked toward the edge of the flooded ground, stopping where the water began to thin. He crouched and touched the mud with his fingers, rubbing it slowly, testing its consistency. The soil was loose, oversaturated, weak. It would not hold weight today, or tomorrow. Others watched him closely now, not because he demanded attention, but because they no longer trusted their own instincts. The rain had proven them wrong too thoroughly. What happens next? Someone asked. The question carried more weight than it sounded like it should. The man stood slowly and looked toward the tree line, then back at the river, then at the sky. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with damp air that smelled of crushed leaves and wet earth. More rain, he said, just not like that. Some groaned quietly. But the ground won't drain fast, he continued. Not here. The water will linger. Things that look stable won't be. That unsettled them more than the storm itself. They had survived the worst of it, or so they thought. Now they were being told that survival wasn't finished yet, that the jungle simply shifted its threats instead of removing them. People began to move their remaining belongings closer to the raised shelter, not out of panic, but out of instinct. They stacked what little firewood remained on the elevated platform. They hung soaked clothing where air could reach it. No one asked permission. The shelter had become something else now. Not just protection, authority. By midday, the river receded slightly, revealing debris caught in branches and roots, broken tools, pieces of roofs, fragments of life that had belonged somewhere specific before the jungle decided otherwise. A man downstream shouted suddenly. Everyone turned. He was pointing at the bank where the water had pulled away enough to expose a collapsed section of ground. What had looked solid before the storm had hollowed beneath the surface. One wrong step would have dropped someone straight into moving water. Several people backed away instinctively. The man who built the shelter walked closer, studying the break carefully. That's why I didn't dig, he said. The statement confused them at first. Then it clicked. Others had tried to anchor their shelters by sinking posts deep into the ground, trusting depth to mean strength. But the rain had turned the soil into something unreliable, something that could shift invisibly beneath the surface. His shelter had barely touched the ground at all. It rested above it. Someone exhaled slowly. So you trusted the air, he said. The man shook his head. I trusted movement, he replied. Nothing here stays still. Not water, not soil, not trees. You build something that refuses to move. It breaks. You build something that moves too much. It collapses. They looked back at the shelter with new understanding. It wasn't rigid. It wasn't flimsy. It was cooperative. The jungle didn't feel challenged by it. It felt acknowledged. By afternoon, fatigue began to settle in. The adrenaline that had carried them through the night faded, replaced by soreness and hunger. Fires were attempted again, this time under the raised structure, carefully shielded. The flame took longer to catch, but once it did, it held. Smoke drifted upward and away, never pooling, never stinging the eyes. Someone noticed that too. Every detail that had once looked strange now looked intentional. A few men began inspecting the structure more closely, tracing the joints, testing the lashings, studying the spacing between boards. Questions surfaced, hesitant at first, then more direct. Why leave gaps? Why angle the roof like that? Why not reinforce it more? The man answered when asked, briefly, without lecture. He didn't explain principles. He described observations. Because wind needs somewhere to go. Because water chooses the shortest path. Because too much strength in one place means weakness somewhere else. They listened, not as skeptics anymore, as students. Late in the afternoon, clouds gathered again, not dark, not violent, but heavy enough to demand attention. The jungle was not finished. The man climbed back into the shelter and adjusted a few elements, tightened a lash, shifted a panel slightly, repositioned a hanging piece of wood that acted as a windbreak. Small changes. Precise. Others watched him do it, noticing how little effort it took to adapt the structure. It wasn't fixed. It was adjustable. Another lesson. When the rain returned, it came gently at first, testing rather than attacking. Drops tapped against leaves and wood, quiet enough that conversation continued. Then it increased. Not violently, persistently. The ground, already saturated, responded immediately. Small streams formed where none had existed hours earlier. Water flowed along invisible paths, finding the weaknesses it hadn't had time to exploit before. One of the remaining shelters tilted suddenly, then slumped as one side sank deeper. The sound made everyone flinch. Inside the raised shelter, nothing changed. No shift, no warning, just the steady sound of rain passing by. Someone sat down hard and laughed again, exhausted and incredulous. "I don't understand how it's still standing," he said. The man didn't answer this time, because the truth was uncomfortable. It was standing because it had never tried to dominate the environment. It had simply refused to fight it. As evening approached, the rain softened again, settling into a rhythm that suggested it would last through the night, but without fury. People prepared themselves differently this time. They didn't scramble. They didn't rush. They gathered beneath the shelter calmly, laying out what they had salvaged, sharing food quietly, conserving energy. The structure no longer felt temporary. It felt inevitable. As darkness fell, someone asked a question no one had voiced yet. "Why didn't you tell us?" The man looked at him, then out into the jungle beyond the firelight. "Tell you what?" "That this would happen," the man said. "That everything else would fail." The builder was quiet for a long moment. "Because you wouldn't have believed me," he said finally. "And if I tried to convince you, you would have built it wrong." That answer settled heavily. They understood what he meant. If he had explained it before the rain, they would have copied pieces, without understanding the whole. They would have added strength where it wasn't needed, removed flexibility where it mattered. They would have made it theirs, and it would have failed. Late that night, the jungle hummed softly beneath the steady rain. Insects resumed their chorus cautiously. The wind brushed the shelter without force. Inside, people slept. Not deeply, but safely. The man stayed awake again, listening, sensing. Just before dawn, he felt it. Not danger. Change. The rain was ending. Not suddenly. Gradually. The kind of ending that didn't announce itself, but left space behind. When morning came, the jungle exhaled. Mist rose from the ground in thick curtains. Water drained slowly, reluctantly, back toward the river. The world looked bruised but alive. People emerged from beneath the shelter and stood quietly, watching steam rise from the earth. One man walked out to the edge of the clearing and turned back. "They were wrong," he said, not loudly. "All of us." The man who built the shelter nodded once. This wasn't the end of the lesson, but was the moment everyone finally understood that survival here wasn't about strength, or height, or stubbornness. It was about knowing when to stand still, and when to let everything else pass through you. The jungle did not celebrate the end of the rain. It never did. It simply returned to itself, quietly reclaiming balance, as if the storm had been nothing more than a breath held too long. By mid-morning, the mist thinned and the ground began to firm in places where sunlight reached it first. Water still clung to roots and pooled in low pockets, but the movement had slowed. The danger had shifted again, not gone, but quieter. People moved carefully now. They tested each step before trusting it. They avoided areas that looked unchanged, knowing now that appearances meant little here. The raised wooden shelter remained where it had always been, unmoved, unimpressed. Some stood beneath it and looked outward, not with relief, but with humility. They were seeing their surroundings differently now, not as something to conquer, but something to read. One man walked toward the builder and stopped a few paces away. You didn't build this to last forever, he said. The man considered that. No, he replied. I built it to last long enough. That answer mattered, because nothing in the jungle was permanent. Trees fell, rivers shifted, even the ground forgot its shape. The goal was never to defeat the environment, only to stay one step ahead of it. As the day went on, people began dismantling what remained of their old shelters, not in frustration but in acceptance. Some materials could be reused. Others were too damaged to trust again. They brought what they could to the raised structure. But something had changed. They didn't try to rebuild the same way. They started asking better questions. What happens when the wind changes? Where does the water want to go? What moves first when things fail? The man didn't answer all of them. He didn't need to. They had learned how to observe. Later, as the sun climbed higher, birds returned more boldly. Their calls echoed through the trees, stitching sound back into the spaces the storm had emptied. The jungle was healing, and so were the people. Someone noticed that the wooden shelter cast a shadow that moved predictably throughout the day, cooling the space beneath it when the heat grew heavy. Someone else realized the airflow prevented mold from forming on the stored supplies. These weren't accidents. They were consequences of thinking ahead. By evening, plans began to form, not spoken loudly, not declared but understood. Future shelters would be different. Higher, lighter, smarter. The man sat on the edge of the platform, feet dangling above ground that had nearly swallowed everything else. You staying? Someone asked him. He looked out toward the trees again, as he often did. For now, he said. That was as close to a promise as he ever gave. That night, the sky cleared completely. Stars emerged in quiet strength, unchallenged by cloud or rain. Fires burned low but steady, their warmth contained, their smoke guided away without effort. People slept deeply for the first time since arriving, not because the jungle had become safe, but because they had finally learned how to listen. In the days that followed, the raised shelter became a reference point. Others were built nearby, not copied exactly, but inspired by the same thinking. Nothing was identical. Everything was intentional. The jungle continued to test them. Small storms, heavy winds, sudden heat. But each challenge met a different response now. Less panic, more patience, and always observation before action. One evening, weeks later, someone asked the man what had made him think this way in the first place. He smiled faintly. I stopped asking how strong something needed to be, he said, and started asking how much it needed to change. That was the real lesson. Not about wood, not about rain, but about survival itself. Because the world doesn't break what bends. It breaks what refuses. And in a place where nature decides everything, the quietest builders often last the longest. If this story showed you something you hadn't noticed before, if it made you rethink what strength really means, if you believe survival isn't about fighting the world, but understanding it, then you're in the right place. Subscribe and stay with us, because the stories ahead aren't about heroes. They're about people who learned to listen and lived because of it.